Imagine that you are a military analyst in World War II and you're tasked with determining how best to reinforce and protect your military's fighter planes. A part of your study is to document the damage that was done to the planes of returning pilots during various air battles. You observe that averaged over all returning pilots' planes, most of the bullet holes are concentrated at the wingtips, just behind the cockpit, and on the tail section. You are asked to submit a report recommending which parts of the planes to reinforce with extra protection in order to minimize future losses. What would you recommend in this situation? Unless you're already familiar with this example or with the bias in question, it's very likely that your intuitive response here, first of all, would be to suggest extra reinforcement and protection for the sections of the planes that were most commonly hit. Unfortunately, the intuitive response here is wrong. In fact, the correct recommendation is to add extra protection to those areas that are least commonly hit on the returning planes. Why? The key here is to focus not only on the planes that return, but also to consider those planes that have not returned. The pattern of damage to surviving planes is in fact evidence in favor of the conclusion that the parts that are most vulnerable are those that were not hit or damaged on surviving planes, which in turn suggests that the planes that were shot down were likely hit in those other areas where there is less damage in the surviving planes. This example is in fact based on a real-life case. During World War II, statistician Abraham Wald took survivorship bias into account when considering how to minimize military plane losses to enemy fire. The statistical research group at Columbia University, which Wald was a part of, examined the damage patterns of aircraft that returned from missions and recommended adding armor to the areas that showed the least damage based on Wald's reasoning. This contradicted the US military's conclusions that the most hit areas of the planes needed additional armor. Wald noted that the military only considered the aircraft that had survived their missions. Any bombers that had been shot down or otherwise lost had, of course, also been made unavailable for assessment. The bullet holes in the returning aircraft therefore represented areas where a bomber could actually take damage and still fly well enough to return safely to base. This is what is known as survivorship bias, which itself is a special case of the more general selection bias that we talk about in another lesson. The problem here is that the sample being considered is not in fact representative of the entire class and is skewed in favor of only a surviving subset of the class. Similar situations might arise in the context of business, for example. When studying the characteristics of successful businesses, undue weighting or significance may be given to certain characteristics due to the fact that a sufficiently representative sample is not being considered. For example, it might be discovered that the most successful businesses in a particular sector all have CEOs whose families are of Asian extraction. The problem is that in order to be certain that that characteristic is the decisive one in determining success or failure, one would need to look not only at other relatively successful companies in the sector, but also look at all those companies who used to operate in that sector, but ultimately failed or disappeared. It may well turn out that after performing this more comprehensive analysis and broadening the sample, those companies that failed also overwhelmingly had CEOs whose families were of Asian extraction. In that case, the characteristic suddenly becomes less salient and may well turn out to be completely irrelevant to a company's chances of success or failure. Perhaps the most common everyday trope that is indicative of how powerful and subtle the survivorship bias can be is the common refrain that they don't build them like they used to. This platitude is based on a general observation that certain old products of various uses have endured a very long time. One might find that an old brand of tractor is still commonly seen being used on farms, that an old mobile phone can still be charged up and function perfectly after all these years. And then when one looks around at the contemporary context, instances of things breaking down or being discarded or replaced are commonly observed. The temptation then is to conclude that things were just built better in the past or built to last back in the good old days. The problem, of course, is that one is only looking at that subset of products from the past that has in fact survived and overlooking the thousands upon thousands of artifacts from the past that broke or were discarded or were replaced and so on. Those are obviously not available for comparison anymore. And of course, those things that survive will tend to belong to that subset that were indeed well built and robust, even if that was a rarity back in the day. In reality, it may be that far fewer products in the past were well made than are made at the present, but due to survivorship bias, we tend to overestimate the quality of past products and underestimate the quality of contemporary products in virtue of how many we see breaking or being discarded in real time. It is understandable why survivorship bias is so common. After all, when selecting a sample from a particular domain, we're highly likely to only select from those candidates that currently exist, that are before our eyes, so to speak. It takes some extra care and consideration to ask oneself, what about all those who used to be members of this class but no longer exist or who opted out? It may be that those absentees manifest features that would prevent certain generalizations being made about the domain in question. Considering only those who still exist in a domain might cause us to make unjustified inferences about what accounts for certain differences or patterns within that domain. Again, asking those preliminary questions about a selection, about why we chose that selection, can be the difference between truth and systematic error.